Have you ever looked around your home during a completely normal morning and thought, this is finally our stable chapter? Because that's exactly what I believed, right before his mother started hiding paperwork from me.
The smell of cinnamon coffee still reminds me of the last normal morning I had in that house. I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, laughing while my husband Daniel burned toast for the second time that week, and his mother Evelyn sat at the table, flipping through one of those home renovation magazines we used to dream over together. We'd lived in that house for almost 8 years. Every wall color, every piece of furniture, every late mortgage payment we barely survived, it all felt like proof that Daniel and I had built something solid together. And that morning, he kissed me on the forehead before work and said, "We finally made it through the hard part." I believed him. But right before I left for work, I noticed something strange. Evelyn was holding a stack of property documents. And when I walked into the room, Daniel took them from her so fast they almost fell onto the floor. Then he smiled at me like nothing happened. That should have been the moment I realized something was already very wrong. Instead, I grabbed my purse, kissed him goodbye, and rushed out the front door, thinking about grocery lists and laundry detergent, like every other normal Tuesday. That was the thing about Daniel. He was good at making problems disappear before I could look at them too closely. When his construction business struggled 2 years earlier, I picked up extra shifts at the medical office where I worked. I emptied most of my savings to help cover the mortgage when clients stopped paying him on time. There were months I barely slept because I was terrified we'd lose the house. But Daniel always promised things would turn around. And eventually, they did. At least, that's what I thought. That evening, I came home to find Evelyn still there, sitting in the living room with her shoes kicked off like she owned the place. The television was on low, but neither of them were watching it. Daniel looked tense the second I walked through the door. "Long day?" I asked. "Just paperwork," he said quickly. Too quickly. Evelyn smiled at me without warmth. Daniel's been handling important things. Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. During dinner, they kept drifting into quiet conversations that stopped the second I entered the room. Once, while I was rinsing dishes, I caught Evelyn staring at the framed family photo hanging near the hallway. Not at me, at Daniel. Like they shared some private understanding I wasn't part of. Later that night, I woke up thirsty and walked downstairs for water. The kitchen light was still on. Daniel and Evelyn were standing near the table, surrounded by papers. I only caught part of it. "You should have done this years ago," Evelyn whispered sharply. Daniel rubbed his face. "She'll never see it coming." The floor creaked beneath me. Both of them turned instantly silent. For a second, nobody moved. Then Daniel forced a smile onto his face and folded the papers together. "Taxes," he said casually. "We were talking about taxes." I remember standing there in the dim kitchen light, wanting to believe him so badly that I ignored the feeling crawling up my spine. The next morning, I left early for work after Daniel kissed me goodbye like nothing had changed. But halfway through my shift, I realized I'd forgotten my charger at home. And when I pulled into the driveway a few hours later, there was a locksmith changing the locks on my front door. I remember sitting in my car for a few seconds, staring at the front door like my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The locksmith had his toolbox open beside the porch steps. Evelyn stood there with her arms folded tightly across her chest, watching him work. And Daniel, my husband, wouldn't look at me at all. I got out of the car slowly. "What's going on?" Nobody answered immediately. The locksmith glanced awkwardly between us before focusing back on the lock. "Daniel?" I asked again, this time laughing nervously. "Why are the locks being changed?" That's when Evelyn stepped forward, holding a manila folder against her chest. "The property ownership has changed," she said flatly. "You'll need to collect your things and leave." For a moment, I genuinely thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe paperwork for insurance, maybe refinancing, something temporary. But then Daniel finally looked at me, and there was nothing soft left in his face anymore. "The house is in my mother's name now, Tracy. This is our house." The words hit me so hard, I actually felt dizzy. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Daniel exhaled impatiently, like I was making things difficult. "Legally, it isn't anymore." I stared at him in disbelief. "I paid this mortgage with you. I worked double shifts for this house." "You helped," Evelyn interrupted coldly. "That doesn't make it yours." I looked back at Daniel, waiting for him to defend me, to tell her to stop, to explain that this had gone too far somehow. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You signed paperwork years ago giving me refinancing authority. I handled it." Handled it. Like 8 years of marriage was an administrative detail.
How do you sit across from someone for years, build a life together, and secretly plan something like this behind her back?
My throat tightened. "Why would you do this without telling me?" His jaw flexed. "Because you would have made it difficult." The movers arrived less than 20 minutes later. That was the part that hurt most. It had already been planned. Boxes started appearing on the lawn while neighbors peeked through curtains pretending not to watch. Rain began falling in thin, cold drops as strangers carried pieces of my life out through the front door. I kept waiting for Daniel to stop it. He never did. And while Evelyn stood beside the porch looking satisfied, I noticed something strange about Daniel. He didn't look victorious. He looked terrified. Then, just before I pulled away from the curb with whatever fit into my car, I heard Evelyn lean close to him and whisper, "Now make sure she never challenges the transfer." For the first week after Daniel threw me out, I barely functioned. I rented a tiny apartment across town that smelled faintly like mildew and old carpet cleaner. The walls were thin enough to hear strangers arguing at night, and every morning I woke up disoriented, expecting to see the bedroom ceiling from the house instead of cracked plaster and flickering hallway light under the door. I kept replaying everything in my head: the paperwork, the whispered conversations, the locks, the way Daniel couldn't even look at me while my belongings sat in the rain. What hurt most was how carefully planned it all had been. Not impulsive, not emotional. Calculated. About 3 weeks later, envelopes started arriving at my apartment addressed to Daniel. Final notices, debt warnings, collection letters. One of them mentioned business loans I'd never heard about before. That was when the pieces started shifting into place. Daniel's company hadn't recovered the way he claimed. It was collapsing. I took the documents to a lawyer named Andrea Mills, mostly because I needed someone to explain how I could lose my home overnight without even realizing it. Andrea spent less than 10 minutes reviewing the transfer paperwork before her expression changed. "This timing is suspicious," she said quietly. She pointed at the filing dates. The ownership transfer to Evelyn had happened right as creditors began filing claims against Daniel's business. "He may have been trying to shield assets," she explained. "And some of these signatures... Tracy, do you actually remember signing these forms?" I stared at the pages. Some signatures looked familiar, but I couldn't remember the moments themselves. That realization made me sick. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He'd used years of trust like a weapon. After that, he stopped answering my calls completely. Evelyn, meanwhile, sent one message that simply read, "You lost. Move on." Then, before Andrea could formally challenge the transfer in court, everything changed overnight. Daniel died in a highway accident driving home during a storm. Just like that, every unanswered question became heavier. At the funeral, Evelyn barely acknowledged me. She controlled everything, the service, the guests, even access to Daniel's belongings. I stood in the back row feeling less like a widow and more like an intruder. Then 3 days later, a formal court notice arrived at my apartment. Daniel's will was being read. And outside the courtroom the morning of the hearing, Evelyn looked me dead in the eyes and smirked. "You really think he left you anything?" The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. The kind of silence where every cough sounds too sharp. I sat beside Andrea at the long wooden table near the front, while Daniel's family gathered behind Evelyn in dark clothes and stiff expressions. Nobody spoke to me. A few avoided looking at me entirely, like I was someone embarrassing they hoped would disappear quickly. Evelyn looked completely different from the woman who stood on the porch throwing my life into boxes. She looked confident again, composed. She wore an expensive gray suit, her jewelry perfectly matched, one hand resting calmly over a leather folder while she whispered to Daniel's brother about selling the house once probate cleared. Selling the house, like I'd never lived there at all. Andrea leaned closer to me before proceedings began. "There's still something wrong with the transfer documents," she murmured. "The timelines don't fully connect." Before I could ask what she meant, the estate attorney entered, carrying several thick files. The reading started routinely enough. Daniel left small amounts of money to extended relatives. A truck went to his brother. Personal items were divided mechanically, almost coldly. Then the attorney began listing debts tied to Daniel's business, and I noticed Evelyn's expression tighten slightly for the first time all morning. The numbers were worse than I expected. Far worse. Creditors were already preparing claims against the estate. Then the attorney paused. He adjusted his glasses and opened another folder. "Now," he said carefully, "regarding the marital residence." Evelyn interrupted immediately. "That property already belongs to me." The attorney looked up slowly. "Not entirely." The room went still. Andrea straightened beside me so suddenly her chair scraped the floor. "What does that mean?" Evelyn demanded. The attorney removed several stapled pages and continued reading. "There appears to be a survivorship amendment attached to the refinance agreement executed several years earlier." My stomach dropped. Andrea reached for the documents, scanning them rapidly. And then I saw it happen. The exact moment her entire expression changed. Shock. Real shock. "The transfer was incomplete," she whispered to me. Evelyn stood up halfway from her chair. "That's impossible," but the attorney kept reading. According to the legally recorded survivorship clause, Tracy Hale remained co-owner of the property and sole beneficiary of Daniel Hale's residential interest upon his death. Evelyn grabbed the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Then she leaned toward Daniel's brother and whispered in panic, "Why is her name on it?" For the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, Evelyn looked afraid, not angry, not irritated, afraid. The attorney spent the next several minutes explaining what had actually happened, and every sentence felt like another crack running through the version of reality Daniel and Evelyn had forced me to believe. Years earlier, when Daniel refinanced the house during one of his business downturns, a survivorship clause had been added to the mortgage agreement. At the time, neither of us paid much attention to the legal language. Daniel handled the paperwork while I signed where he told me to sign after long shifts at work. But that clause mattered, more than any of us realized. Legally, it protected my ownership interest in the home if Daniel died. And because the later transfer to Evelyn failed to properly disclose that protected interest, she never received full ownership rights, even after Daniel signed documents attempting to give her the property. Andrea explained it bluntly outside the courtroom. "Daniel tried to move the house before creditors could touch it," she said. "But he either ignored or forgot the survivorship filing already attached to the property," meaning the house could never fully become Evelyn's. The realization hit me slowly. That was why Daniel looked nervous the day he threw me out. He knew the transfer might not hold up. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn completely unraveled once the attorney finished explaining the ruling. She accused the law firm of incompetence. Then she accused me of manipulating Daniel somehow. At one point, she even claimed the paperwork had to be forged. But every signature was verified. Every filing was legitimate. And for the first time in weeks, nobody in that room was treating me like I was powerless. The court froze parts of Daniel's estate almost immediately because of the debt investigations tied to his business. Creditors began targeting company assets and financial accounts instead of the house itself. Evelyn lost access to the property entirely. She wasn't even allowed back inside without authorization. A month later, I walked through the front door again. The house looked almost identical. Same kitchen, same dining room, same faint mark on the hallway wall where we'd scraped furniture moving it in years earlier. But the feeling was gone. What I once thought represented loyalty and partnership now felt like evidence. Every room carried memories I suddenly viewed differently. The late nights Daniel stayed working, the paperwork he rushed me through signing, the way Evelyn always acted like the house belonged to their family instead of ours. I finally understood the truth. Daniel hadn't protected me during those hard years. He'd protected himself.
And when things started collapsing financially, he chose the fastest way to save what he could, even if it meant throwing me out of my own home like I was disposable. A few months later, I sold the house. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. I moved to another city, rented a quiet apartment near my new office, and started rebuilding a life that belonged entirely to me for the first time in years. No hidden paperwork, no whispered conversations stopping when I entered the room, no one quietly deciding my future behind closed doors. And honestly, the part I still think about sometimes isn't Daniel's betrayal. It's Evelyn's face in that courtroom the moment she realized the woman she threw out still owned the house all along.
It's strange how someone can share your bed, your bills, your entire future, and still be making decisions about your life without you ever realizing